And we are live. Hi, everyone. It's Dark Journalists. And we have a great show for you tonight because we're going to go deep into some aspects of unanswered questions around this whole period of the Nixon disclosure effort taking place in the early 70s. Now, last night we did Coast to Coast, and we did our live broadcast here about Robert Merritt and his time capsule story, putting that on the record. Now, that is very significant, but unless we understand the context of what was going on in relation to this period and the efforts at disclosure and what Nixon may have had in mind and what they may have been doing in making this documentary that came out a few years later, then we kind of get the whole picture a little bit better. So we're going to work that in. We have a very special guest with us, which is GrantCameron. And Grant, it's great to see you.
Good to see you, Daniel. Thanks for having me on.
Fantastic. I've been following your stuff, of course, on the disclosure front. We had you on last month, and that was an excellent episode. And I think we all got a lot of answers because you've been so on top of what's going on with the current disclosure efforts that it's pretty remarkable. And we can see that so many of those, as you predicted, and as I did some reports on, a lot of the things around the To the Stars disclosure just came apart at the seams. And we still see a lot of strange maneuvering going on and not a whole lot of answers or a whole lot of new releases. And so I want to get into that also, but I want to start right off the bat with what we were just talking about, which is something called Nixon's Pyramid. I'm going to show this to everyone, which is, it's a complex that they put up in the 70s as a kind of anti-ballistic missile site in North Dakota. And they call it Nixon's Pyramid because he was the guy who was in office when it got put up there. And apparently it helped create the conditions for the SALT I and SALT II treaties. But if you can just give us some idea, Grant, of what it was and the strange activity around it.
Well, the way it started is I had some sightings in 1975 on the Canadian side of the border. I lived just north of that site. And that was in Cool's Route, North Dakota. And we couldn't understand why we were having the sightings. We had sightings that went on from about February of 1975 till late 1975, and then a little bit into 1976. And then it just went away. There was no sightings. Suddenly this object was being seen almost every night, and then just went away. And nobody has seen anything in that town since. And it was 30 years later when I was lecturing on it, I went to talk to the guy who ran the airport at Carmen where all these sightings had taken place. And I said to him, Bob, I said, why were the sightings here? Like, why do you think they came to Carmen? Because there's nothing here. And he said, I told you in 75 why they were here. And I said, well, no, I don't remember. He said, I told you, you know exactly why they were here. And I said, Bob, it's been 30 years. I have no idea why the UFOs were here. And he said, the missiles in North Dakota. And as soon as he said that, I knew what he was talking about because we had all traveled through North Dakota, and we knew that North Dakota, it was said that if North Dakota had been a country, it would have been a nuclear superpower. It had 300 silos, Minuteman III missile silos. And in 1975, they were going to build 3 units. One was at Malmstrom, one was the North Dakota site, and then there was one in the east that they were going to build. The only one that actually got built was in North Dakota. So what they set up was the Nixon's Pyramid, which was the big, it looked like an actual pyramid with the top cut off. And it was the radar that would pick up the Russian missiles. So what they had is they had put in another 100 nuclear missiles. So some of them had 5 megaton warheads on them. And what they were trying to do before Star Wars, like in Star Wars, you would have these things in outer space to try to shoot down the Russian missiles. So what they would do is this radar establishment inside the pyramid would pick up the Russian missile coming over the North Pole, and then they would shoot up these 5. The idea was to shoot up these 5 megaton nuclear missiles and destroy the Russian missiles in outer space. And if they missed, then they had these these sprint missiles with 1 megaton missile on them, and they would try to shoot them as they were coming down into the missiles, because the idea was that the missiles were the #1 target of the Soviets. The idea was that if you don't take out the missiles in North Dakota and Montana and South Dakota, you weren't going to see what happened to Washington. So that was the #1 target. So what happened is in 1975, they went operational with these 100 new nuclear missiles in February of 1975. That's when the sightings started on our side of the border. In November, they had an agreement with the Russians to shut the establishment down. That's when the sightings basically stopped and went away and never came back. So that was the whole deal in North Dakota. And it was about 80 miles as the crow flies from where the very high point of the sightings were. And I actually had the same guy who ran the airport, Bob Diemert, had told me, he said, I told you, don't you remember I told you I had the meeting with the Air Force guy on the border in a bar at the border. And this guy had said that they actually at one point had a UFO over top of one of the missile silos and they had been ordered to ram it. And that they had these 4 jets and he had pulled out of the formation and the UFO had come up where he had pulled out. He said it wasn't worth his life. And he said, I told you. And when he mentioned that, I did remember him telling me that back in 1975, this story about them actually getting one over a missile silo. And I was actually called down to North Dakota in 1976. We had these objects on the ground that people would now describe as orbs. We called them ground lights. We had them all over the ground and we were filming them. I had infrared film. We'd be there almost every night trying to film these things. They were very responsive, but very smart. They always knew not only what you were doing, but what you were about to do. And we couldn't get around these things. I got close the very first night. I was about maybe 50 feet away the first night from one of these objects, maybe 2.5, 3 feet across, orb type object. And these things started to appear in 1976. And so in 76, I was called down to North Dakota to the Minot field where the Minot nuclear Air Force base was. And that's where a lot of the missiles were in the Minot field. There was a town there that was being inundated by these same objects all over the ground. They were following cars, stuff like that. So that tied in, again, the fact that nuclear missiles had a very close connection to the phenomena of UFOs. The last thing that happened is I had a girl, and this would go to 1988, we move on. And this was at Coolsroot, North Dakota. And what they used to do, she told me the story, there was 3 girls. I only interviewed her at length with her husband or their boyfriend at the time. And I actually went to the missile silo, which is still operational, Minuteman III missile silo. And she described the fact that in the town, it was a small town of maybe a couple of hundred people. What the kids would do in the town is they would go to the missile silo, which was about a mile, maybe half a mile north of the town. They would throw stones at the fence. They would try to get the light to go on. There was a big, sort of a big pole with a white light on a yellow light on the top. And they would try to get the light to go on. And then they would run as fast as they could back to town. And that's what they did for entertainment. And the one time they went there and there was 3 girls and she describes this UFO coming out of the missile silo. And I said, well, we were standing at the fence, we're taking pictures. And I said, well, where exactly did this thing come out? And she said, it came out of that metal thing over there. I said, are you sure it came right out of the metal thing? Yep, came right out of the metal thing. She described it as being, I can't remember how many feet across. It was fairly small, maybe 5-6 feet across, copper shaped, copper colored like a ball. It was spinning at a very high speed. She wet her pants. The other girls went running back and they had seen this object. It was about 25 feet above the missile silo and then it just flew off. So that's basically how I started, was this very bizarre connection to nuclear missiles. And if you remember back in 1975, and this is a story that I have told only a couple of times, there was a guy who Richard Doty referred to as the DIA Falcon. He was a guy at Offutt Air Force Base, who was the guy who I believe phoned Bill Moore. Bill Moore got 2 phone calls as he started. One was from Albuquerque, New Mexico. He'd gone on the book tour for the book, The Roswell Incident. So he gets this phone call and the guy says from Albuquerque, who might have been Richard Doty, said, "You're the only guy who knows what you're talking about." And he sort of agreed with
classic line.
And then he further toured across the country, and he got the second phone call from Offutt Air Force Base. And what I believe it was this guy by the name of Evans, Major Evans, who was Richard Doty's DIA man in Washington. He was with the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he had moved to Offutt Air Force Base in about 1978, 79. Bob Pratt had interviewed him. And I remember, because Bob Pratt of National Enquirer had come up to Manitoba where we had the sightings. He'd come up actually twice. because there was just so many sightings. They were going to call it the UFO capital of the world. He came up, and I remember him telling me about the fact that they had these documents. They'd gotten these documents. And I remember they had filed the FOA, and it was like $850 to get the documents. And I went, whoa. And he said, oh, yeah, we're going to pay it. No problem. We'll pay the fee. And these were the documents, the famous NORAD documents that describe in 1975 along the Canadian-U.S. border where all the nuclear missiles were stored. So it was Loring Air Force Base. There was Worth Smith Air Force Base on the Michigan-Canadian border. There was Minot Air Force Base, which is south of us, where I went to see these small objects on the ground. And the other was Malmstrom. And there was these reports in late 1975, exactly when Travis Walton was abducted, where UFOs were inside the weapon storage area, inside where they stored the nuclear weapons. So I knew right from 1975 that there was this connection, very close connection to nuclear weapons and UFOs. And you see it go on with Benowitz. That's how Benowitz's story started. Benowitz just was describing UFOs over the Manzano weapon storage area. And that was the biggest repository for nuclear weapons in the world.
That's fascinating. And I want to actually get into how the nuclear weapons aspects fits in here. I'm curious in relation to the Nixon pyramid, though. This is the actual structure. Okay.
Yeah. And it's still there.
That's fascinating that it's still there. Why? Is there ever any explanation for why it's a pyramid?
No. I just, in researching it, I only started to research it maybe 6 or 7 years ago, because that's when I discovered that until then, I didn't even know that they had built this thing in 1975. And so when I went down there, it's not operational anymore. They took all the missiles out in 75, and the pyramid is still there. It was actually sold. I can't remember what they spent. I think they sold it for, a couple $1 million, the whole property. It was just recently sold. But there was that radar establishment, and then there was another one just on the Canadian border. But these were these radars that were trying to pick up the Russian missiles as they were inbound.
Mm-hmm. Wow. It's interesting too, because when we think about this, there's something about this UFO presence around nuclear bases, and it's been going on since very early era. I guess it's Robert Salas that really tracks that closely. You've been looking at these cases for years. What do you think? What are the UFOs doing around the nuclear weapons sites, including Rendlesham? That's also another nuclear case.
Yeah, that was where they had the forward-based nuclear weapons that were illegal. That they had said there was no nuclear weapons on the UK territory. It is a key thing. I mean, that's when the modern UFO era starts, when we detonate the atomic bomb. Mm-hmm. And the guy who ran the Canadian government UFO program from 1950 to 1954, Wilbert Smith, who ran the Project Magnet, which was the Canadian government flying saucer program, was a contactee. And we kept this secret for many, many years, that he was actually in contact with aliens. And he had been told by the being that he was dealing with, whose name was AFFA. And this was actually the same alien that the CIA channeled in 1959 at the National Photographic Interpretation Center. It was exactly the same alien.
Wow.
So he said that he had been told by AFFA that the only time they would ever step in is if there was a nuclear exchange, and that they could stop a nuclear exchange. And I think what he told Walt Andrus from MUFON, Walt Andrus told me this story many, many years ago, that Wilbur told him that AFFA had said, if there's a nuclear exchange, we can stop it. And people may not believe that, but in order to prove that we could stop it, we could actually take the moon in front of the entire world, split it in half, and put it back together again to prove that we could do this. We have the power to stop a nuclear exchange. Other than a nuclear exchange, according to what Wilbur had said to Walt Andrus, they will do nothing. They will allow us to stew on our own juices. But the nuclear weapon thing is always, so right in from the word go, the Canadians were describing the fact that nuclear weapons, and Wilbur had written quite a bit about this. He said, the nuclear weapon thing, people sort of get the idea that you have the above ground effects, but you also have an effect of the nuclear weapon going down through the earth. And he talked about what he called areas of reduced binding. And he claimed that there was aircraft plane crashes that were taking place because of this reduced binding. He'd actually built a thing called the binding meter, where he could get these, detect these areas on the other side of the earth from nuclear detonations, where planes would be flying through, and they would actually just sort of fall apart because the binding forces that held the plane together were affected by these nuclear weapons. So Wilbur Smith actually wrote quite a bit about the dangers of nuclear weapons, and this is in the early days, the same as, you know, all the early contactees all appear. For example, the first contactees, Adamski and Williamson, appeared about a week after the detonation of the hydrogen bomb. So that's when all this sort of stuff started. And now we know more and more with, you know, with the books, you know, that have been written on nuclear weapons and the stories about the Russians and stuff like that. We now know this connection, that they seem to be very much disturbed by the environmental thing and by the nuclear weapon stuff. That seems to be, if you talk to the experiencers, they keep getting these messages that they're very concerned about these two elements of the way we treat the world.
Absolutely. And it is fascinating. That's a continual pattern that we see. I know John Mack got into that quite a bit, and most of his contactees had seen these visions of environmental disaster. When we get into the response aspect and we look at somebody like President Nixon, who was deep in there in the 1950s in these programs, there's a whistleblower that came out through Linda Moulton Howe named Cooper, who describes Nixon's involvement in 1958, monitoring the situation that was going on in the kind of Area 51 style redevelopment stuff. Now, when Nixon gets into office, and we have these kind of interesting things that have happened, you know, UFOs showing up at nuclear bases, they obviously had some sort of national security interest around this. Now, we've been following this story of Robert Merritt, which we broke here 2 weeks ago, and he's somebody who worked for the Houston Plan and worked for President Nixon doing these various things. But Nixon had told him about a time capsule that he'd put away, this message to the American people that had something to do with his work around the UFO file and the ET part. So what I'm trying to do is, there's a great thread in your work about the Emenegger documentary and that stage of the early disclosure. It's almost like the first phase of real disclosure in the early 70s. Can you tell us how that project started and what Emenegger's role was, and how the Nixon administration and the Republican establishment got involved with it?
Okay, I described the Emenegger story that you're referring to as the top disclosure story in ufology. Is actually in contact with Eric Davis, who's the chief scientist for Hal Puthoff, recently over the To the Stars situation. And he had said that it was the first disclosure effort, that this is the second disclosure effort, the To the Stars thing.
Okay.
So I said to him, I said, well, does Hal agree with that? And he said, yeah, Hal agrees with that. That the Emenegger thing was the first effort. I believe there was 3 efforts, but anyway, the first one was
Hal was involved with that first one too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, they came to me because of the Holloman Air Force Base film.
Right.
The story centers around the fact that Bob Emenegger and Alan Sandler, who's actually the intelligence guy. So Bob is the worker guy. He writes the music for the documentaries. He does the interviews. He runs around. And it's actually Alan Sandler, who's never really gone on record, never really done any interviews. That's actually the intelligence guy that sets this whole thing up. The way it was told to me, and Bob, the last time I talked to him, and I've talked to him a number of times about this because he lives just outside of Eureka Springs, Arkansas, and I go down to that conference quite a bit. I used to lecture there every year. And so I would talk to him and stay at his house and stuff. And at one point, I'm sure he told me that the reason that they got the job was that the defense person that did the documentaries, their company, had messed up something with the Pentagon Papers, and that they had left them and they had come to Bob and Alan Sandler. And so the way the story starts is Bob says, we get this call, and it's the Vietnam War time, and they're told to come to Norton Air Force Base in California, and this is where the DAVA is, Defense Audiovisual Agency, where they kept all the military film. And they come there and they meet with Paul Chartle, who's the security manager at the base. And Paul Chartle says, we want you to do some documentaries for the U.S. military. We want to present a better light to the U.S. military for the people. And the documentaries that they sort of looked at doing, which apparently they did, there were a documentary on 3D holography, working with dolphins, working with dogs, computers, these sort of documentaries. And I think they were asked to do 8 documentaries.
And let's say 1971.
I think it's a little bit later. The exact date is 72 somewhere. I think it was 72, and I think the documentary finally came out in 75.
Okay.
But it's in that time. It's in that time period, and so it's at that point that Paul Shardle says, and we also want you to do this other documentary on UFOs, and we want you to hide it under the other 8 documentaries. And it was that point that Bob said, "What? You mean this is for real?" And he was a total skeptic, and he's still basically a total skeptic, because his wife's name is Margaret, and she's really sharp. I mean, she knows everything about UFOs. She reads about UFOs and stuff like this. And sometimes when I'd be at the house, but Bob would get skeptical about something happening in ufology, and then she would say, "You know, be quiet. What do you know? You don't read anything. You don't know." And she's sort of the expert, and he said, and his interest is sit there and watch the Comedy Channel. He's no interest in UFOs.
Right. He's not a UFO guy. Yeah.
When he got this thing in the 70s, when they said this UFO thing is real, he said, "You mean it's for real?" And all he could think about, as he told me, was how many times he told Margaret, "Quit reading that stupid UFO, the alien had my baby. That's a bunch of garbage." And suddenly this guy's telling him this stuff's for real. And that's when Paul Shardle says, "Yes, it's for real. What would you think if I told you that we'd actually filmed an alien landing at Holloman Air Force Base, a craft landing at Holloman Air Force Base, from a number of different angles?" And then Bob he was just sort of floored. And so what the offer was, that we would give you the documentary, we'd give you the film for the documentary. Now, this had happened many times before. It happened to Walt Disney in 1956, I believe. Disney had exactly the same offer. He was going to be given films and all this kind of stuff. And that was pulled back. But Bob went ahead with the documentary, and the way he describes it in terms of ufology, he said, you know, basically to him, everything it's all garbage. Everybody's making up stuff, and I know it's for real. We got to go everywhere. And he would describe the fact that anybody they wanted to talk to, they could talk to. They talked to Robert Friend, who was the Blue Book guy. They talked to Arthur Lundahl. Arthur Lundahl was the guy who ran the Weird Desk before Kit Green, before Ron Pandolfi. Wow. It was Arthur Lundahl, and that Arthur Lundahl had actually dropped this story about the channeling the alien in July of 1959 at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, which was this very top secret CIA building in Washington, where they analyzed all the U-2, the SR-71, the spy photographs. That's where it was all done. And that they had this Navy intelligence guy who had actually dealt with a contactee in Maine who was in contact with this alien by the name of AFFA. She had taught him how to channel.
Swan, right?
What's that?
That's a woman named Swan that they go to.
Yeah, Frances Swan. And so this Navy intelligence guy had been taught how to do this. And of course, he went running back. He was Navy intelligence, was working for the CIA. They went back to Arthur Lundahl, and he said, "She taught me how to do this. She taught me how to channel." And Art Lundahl is telling Bob this whole story, and he actually takes Bob to the site. And if you look at the documentary, it was called UFOs Past, Present, and Future. I think it was first released in 1975. It was released in 1976, and then in 1979 they redid it with a Rod Serling narrating. And then it was called UFOs That Has Begun. So if people want to see it, it's actually on the internet. You can watch it on YouTube. It's called UFOs That Has Begun, the 1979 version. And on there, you can see Robert Friend actually telling this story. They're in the room where this actually happens, and Robert Friend is telling the story. He's working for Blue Book at the time. He gets this phone call from Arthur Lundahl and says, "You can't believe what happened. You got to get down here. Top secret, Rice down here." Gets on a plane, he flies down, and they put this guy back under sort of like a channeling trance, where he's interacting with this being the second time. So Robert Friend actually tells the whole story on this documentary that Bob does.
Doesn't he actually say that when he's in that state, they ask him, "Can you show us your craft?" Yeah. Go to the window, and the craft shows up.
The craft flies by the window. And that's when Arthur Lundahl contacted a friend at Blue Book and said, "You got to come down here right away." And he flies down. They put this guy back under. And that's when they say, "We want you to appear again." And he said the time isn't right. So it doesn't happen the second time. But The document is actually, there's a handwritten document. It's kind of a weird story. The story that I was told, and I was given the document by Jacques Vallée. Once I put the story out, Jacques Vallée contacted me and said, okay, you got the story. Here's the document. Now, the document was a handwritten document. It's 11 pages long, and it's supposedly the story I was told. It was sitting on Robert Friend's desk, and J. Allen Hynek had seen it. And J. Allen Hynek realized that this was a CIA memo, realized this was important, and he had actually handwritten the document out on paper. And this is the document I got. So this is this plausible deniability. It's not the CIA the memo, but it mentions the CIA people. I think there's 8 CIA agents are in this second meeting. When Robert Friend is brought down there, all these CIA people are mentioned. It tells the whole story. So when this is told to Bob Emenegger as part of this documentary, he asks Arthur Lundahl. Arthur Lundahl's telling the story. Arthur takes him to Washington. He said, can you go on camera? And Arthur said, no, I can't go on camera. Don't you understand? And he said, what do you mean? He said, I'm on the job. I can't go on camera. And that's why they put Robert Friend. So Bob does this whole documentary. He goes to the Pentagon and the way he describes it, the Pentagon, they have unlimited access. They actually describe the fact that they walk in the Pentagon. They don't sign in. They're actually able to walk right into the Pentagon. Wow. Now, this is pre 9/11, before all the heavy security, but this is what they said. And the story he described is they got into the Pentagon, and they sat down, and I guess the information people, before they went up to the E-ring to meet with Colonel Coleman, said, you know, this is causing us a lot of trouble. You guys got to stop doing this. Every time you do these kind of stupid documentaries, the phone comes off the hook. And then Sandler goes, what are you talking about? You're the guys that invited us here. I mean, what are you giving? And then they sort of quieted down, and they went up, and that was when the way that Bob described to me, it was an actual contract. They had an actual contract. It was no different than any other documentary they'd ever done. And they were sent to Colonel Weinbrenner at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And it was there where they were talking to him. And now,
Weinbrenner this is interesting because he is the head, as I understand it, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't he the head of the Foreign Technology Office, which is something that Corso was in before he got there? And of course, Corso came out with all those stories later.
Yeah, well, Corso was with the Army, but Weinbrenner was with the Defense Department. So he's like the head guy. And Bob tells this very bizarre story how he leans against Weinbrenner's desk and he said, so, you know, what's really going on? And he goes to the blackboard and he starts drawing on the blackboard about the MiG-23 and the Russians know everything we're doing. And we got to keep it quiet. And he's sort of talking as if there was a mic in the room or something. It was Emenegger said it was very, very bizarre. Like he was trying to get across the idea. And then he picked up J. Allen Hynek's book and he hands it to Bob Emenegger and he opens it up. And inside it's J. Allen Hynek says to my good friend, General Weinbrenner, J. Allen Hynek. And he's basically giving the hint, I can't talk about this. And so Bob would tell these very bizarre stories of how he was able to go everywhere. For example, when he went to do the Holloman Air Force Base story, he phoned up Holloman Air Force Base because they wanted to go film where they had actually filmed this UFO landing. And the head guy at Holloman Air Force Base, he said, you want to do what? Are you crazy? Do you realize this is a top secret base? You're crazy. You're not going anywhere. And there was a guy by the name of Major Verona, who was their sort of liaison guy in the Pentagon. So they told Verona, they told us to get lost. They said, they're not letting this on the base. He said, give me 10 minutes, come back. He comes back in 10 minutes. He phones up the guy. He says, you want to come? Come on down. And Bob said they went down. They were on the Holloman base. They were given a car with a lieutenant, and the guy drove them around, and they would go anywhere they wanted. And Bob was telling the story. They had actually put this craft in a hangar. So all the details, Bob had been given all the details. 6 o'clock in the morning. I think there was a helicopter and 3 places on the ground where they were filming, exactly which hangar it was on what part of the base. So they go to the hangar and they actually take a crowbar and they open up the door of this hangar. So Bob said they had this sort of unlimited ability to walk around and do all this kind of stuff. So the end of the story is they get all this material together, and it's at the very end they're about to put in the Holloman Air Force Base. They've got the film. And Bob claims he didn't see it. So he said, I only saw storyboard drawings of the thing. I never really looked at it, or except to look up at the film at this thing. And at the very end, they got the phone call from Coleman at the Pentagon and said, it's the Watergate. The time isn't right. We have to pull the film. You can't have the film. So it's exactly what happened to.
Wait, who was it who called him and said that?
Coleman.
Okay.
Coleman said we have to pull the film. And so Bob tells a story of these very heavy set couple, and they're in a small Datsun, and they have to go from California, from Los Angeles, where they're doing the filming, and they have to drive all the way back to the Pentagon with this film. And they take the film back, and they have to storyboard, so they have to sort of make it up. So if you see here Rod Serling, he said, this is an incident that may have happened in the past or may happen in the future. And they sort of have to sort of make it up. But what happens is they put this into the documentary, and you see they make this thing where they've got the guy talking, and he's saying, identify yourself. You can, and the radar thing is going around, and all of a sudden this object appears on the screen. And so they run the documentary, and it's years later that I learn that it's actually Holloman film. That's actually 8 seconds. Of the film.
8 seconds. Okay.
8 seconds of the film. And that's when I phoned Bob up and I said, Bob, you told me they took the film back. And he said, well, I did. And he tells me the whole story about these people and the canisters in the back seat and taking them back to the Pentagon. I said, but Bob, there's 8 seconds of film in the documentary. And he said, well, yeah. And I said, but you said they took it back. So why is there 8 seconds of film in the documentary? And he said, well, it was just background. And I said, what do you mean it's background? And he said, well, it didn't show anything. And that's true. If you look at the documentary, you can see clearly the 8 seconds, because it sort of breaks, and you can see, and what it does is it shows an object coming over the hill, but you don't see the actual aliens. When the beings get out, that's classified material, because and the actual shape of the craft as it lands up close, that's classified. But just to show the object, it's almost like the films that the To the Stars have shown. Okay, it's an object, but it really doesn't, it's not up close. There's no aliens. It's sort of like, it's not really classified material. You can sort of release that kind of stuff. So that's basically what happened. So
let's take a look just briefly at this, because I got some snaps from it. That is Emenegger, and that is his documentary, UFOs.
And he does the book. He also does a book as well.
Okay.
That sells, I think, 1 million copies.
Right. And they re-released it, of course, and it had, Rod Serling had died by then, but they put in Jacques Vallée, and it is interesting. They actually do some of the first cattle mutilation stuff. When I watched the both versions, this is what I want to ask you, actually. This is what they have as the alien that comes out to meet the military person. There's a little bit of a controversy about this, and you actually, I got this from one of your lectures. Let me see if I can find it here. It's this comparison shot, which I think is really good for us to take a look at.
Yeah.
So these are depictions from this Sumerian in this British History Museum, but they're also used as these aliens in the book. So can you tell me about that?
Yeah. Well, that was brought up by Michael Luckman, who wrote the book Alien Rock. And I knew him fairly well. And he suddenly phoned me up one day and he said, they faked the whole thing. They faked it. I said, what do you mean they faked it? So he sent me the photograph of the statue, or in the British Museum, and Emenegger's alien that had appeared in the book and had appeared in the documentary, and it did look very close. And it was kind of a weird sort of thing. So I phoned up Bob and I said, well, Bob, what is this? And I saw the correspondence between him and Sandler was really upset that they had made this claim. So I asked Bob, I said, well, why would it look so close? And that's when he said to me, he said, and this made sense. It was almost like the film with the UFO coming over the hill. He said, I never saw the film. And the film was done by, he actually named the guy. It was a police artist that they had. And that Paul Shardle had sat down, and Paul Shardle was the guy that had originally seen the film. He's the one that went on UFO Cover Up Live in 1988 and described what was on the film, this sort of stuff. It was Paul Shardle who described to the police artist what the alien looked like. So what I think happened was that he basically described this alien. He couldn't describe the exact alien. So Shardle gave this description of this alien, this bizarre looking alien with the nose and with the breathing apparatus on the mouth and stuff like that. And that's why it had come out. Now, maybe he saw that thing in the British Museum, but it was this sort of protecting classified material. What did the alien actually look like? Because there's no doubt that it was very close to the alien. But Bob had said that he never saw it and that this was actually done by Paul Shardle describing the alien.
Do you think, I find there's a few interesting things that happen around this period, because of course Zecharia Sitchin shows up in this period and gets into the whole Sumerian Anunnaki thing, and that is also very Middle Eastern looking. This is also another shot of the alien from the documentary, and they are compelling shots. But what do you think was going on there? Because you're saying, okay, again, they're going into this thing where they're saying, well, we can't really show a depiction of the alien that came out and greeted the military officials, but we can do a depiction that might be similar in a sense. But what do you think is going on there?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I think they're just staying away from classified material because I believe Bob didn't really see the beings, and they may have just picked up on Sitchin or some idea of let's put this out. We have to put out some sort of alien depiction, and to me, it just reminded me of the idea that the object that they showed was far away. You couldn't really determine anything. And that when it comes to classified material, you can tell the story, but you have to fictionalize everything. And that's basically the way the disclosure stuff has been done, is you take real material, you fictionalize it, you change it, you put it out, and then you can sort of get away with it. Even like the To the Stars video with the Nimitz video. And I always maintain, they say it's the same as this 2007 video. And one of my updates, I play it. There's absolutely no way it's the same video because the To the Stars has this bizarre noise in the background, like a vacuum cleaner going in the background. The 2007 doesn't, and that's what I think happens. Is whether you're doing MJ12 documents, whether you're doing films or whatever, if you alter the video, you can release it. You alter it a little bit. It's the real video, but you alter it a little bit, and then when people say, you can say it's a hoax. It's not the same thing because you've altered the video. It's a different video. So you may, in a document, you may change 1 or 2 words in the document. It's a hoax document. You're getting the idea across, because it comes down to this thing. If you really want to disclose, if you really want to show what the alien looks like, if you really want to show the Haldeman film, you would actually release the Haldeman film. And there's been a number of attempts, like Eric Davis and Hal Puthoff came to me many years later. Because what happened was that Bob and Alan Sandler and Paul Shardle appeared on what I said was the second UFO disclosure. That was 1988, the UFO Cover-Up Live. They appear on that show. Shardle describes what's on the film. They describe all this kind of stuff, and you get this situation where they tell the story, but you really don't get anything detailed. It's another half. You could actually release the film because Puthoff was looking for it, and what happened then is that Senator Dodd from Connecticut had actually got a request to FOIA that film. The people were furious when that film was referenced in 1988. And they went, and all they could find out that it was in a Navy sink. That's what Hal Puthoff was told, and nobody could really identify what that really meant. So nobody was able to recover the actual document. And the whole thing is, if you want disclosure, you release the document. If you want to cover up, you don't do anything. Right. But if you want to sort of get it out, half get it out, you do this sort of, you alter it, you change it, you put it out, you spin it, and that's what they may be doing with the Nimitz or with the video or with the picture of this alien, where they alter it. You put something out, but it's not the real item.
Fascinating. And let's go into this though, and go from Puthoff's angle, saying that he thought it was the most important, this attempt in the early 70s to have UFO disclosure. That was stopped because of the Watergate incident. They pulled off, but let's talk about how they got in.
That's the excuse they used. That wasn't that. It's whether it was Disney's excuse. That's what they do. They drag you along. It's like what people don't realize is that Emenegger had a second effort, 1983.
Right.
He's called again. Do you know this story?
Yes, and I want to. That's exactly the story I'm leading to. I just want to clarify this one point about the early version. So Nixon, in that period, somehow the Republican Party and the Nixon administration. Now, there's a Bob Haldeman connection to Emenegger. That's his friend, and he also has another friend who's an aide to Nixon.
Hershenson was the communications guy. Yeah.
Right.
So he was in the Air Force with Hershenson, and he was at UCLA with Bob Haldeman. Bob Haldeman was 1 year older than Bob, and so he got to know Bob Haldeman. And there was so when the filming was going on, Bob said there was a CIA guy on the set the entire time that they were filming. The other thing that he said was the fact that he had asked Bob Haldeman. He said, "What's this thing about? Was there actually a landing at Haldeman Air Force Base?" And Haldeman had said to him, "Well, I sort of heard something about that, but I really don't know." And Hershenson was on the phone with him every day while they were shooting. Wow. Really not asking anything, but just seeing how's it going and stuff like that. So you had this interaction with.
They're overseeing it from afar.
Yeah, and yet they were hands off. That there was no real connection. The only real connection, you may have talked to Lundahl about that, and there's been a couple of confrontation. That is the fact that when it was all said and done, Bob was in LA. He was a vice president for Gray Advertising, and that's an important part that Linda may have brought up. Gray Advertising was always seen as a front company for the CIA.
Right.
So they used Gray Advertising. Not that Bob had anything to do with it, but they used Gray Advertising to do these kind of disclosure things. So the UFO Cover Up Live thing was done by Gray Advertising, and so was Bob's 1975 documentary. They're both done by Gray Advertising.
Yeah.
And so Bob has this. And so the other couple of stories that other people don't know is the fact that Bob, when I talked to him about the film, he actually said they had a bunch of film, they had a bunch of photographs and stuff. And at that point I said to him, he told me about another film that they had that they were going to put in and they didn't put in. It was a film that you may have heard about. We're not sure if it's the same film, but it was a launch from Vandenberg Air Force Base. And the missile is shot out over the Pacific, and they're tracking it with the cameras. And suddenly these two UFOs interact with the missile. And Bob just describing this film, and I'm going, well, I've heard about this film before. And he said he named the guy who had done the analysis. He was the guy who had done the analysis for the Robertson panel UFO stuff in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. And he had looked at this film and he said, there's 1 in a million chance this is not for real. This is the real deal. These are actual objects around this missile. So when I was talking to Bob, and there was many things that Bob, because he's not interested in the subject, he's not interested in UFOs. And I would have to keep asking him questions. So I said to him, oh, okay, so you sent the Haldeman film back. Did you send that film back too? And he went, no, I don't think we sent that one back. I said, what? You still got the film? And he said, I have to check with Alan. No, I don't think we ever sent that film back. And he went and checked with Alan Sandler, and they still have the film. It's top secret. It has Quintanella's name on the canister. And I know that I had talked to Angela Joyner. This was just after the Stevensville thing happened. I was dealing with Angela Joyner, and I told her, and she told James Fox. And James Fox has done some negotiation, a bunch of negotiation to try to get this film. He was going to put it in 701. But they actually have this film that they actually didn't hand back.
We know what year it's from?
What's that?
We know what year it's from.
No, wait, I just know it was a launch from Vandenberg Air Force Base.
Okay.
And it was over the Pacific. And there was so many stories that I would get out of him later on, where it just wasn't significant to him to do it. Like, for example, I said to him, Bob, if it weren't for the location and everything, this looks like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And he said, what? I didn't tell you? And I said, no, you didn't tell me what? He said, I didn't tell you I gave a copy to Steven Spielberg. I said, no, you didn't tell me that. And it was like the film was 75, the documentary. Close Encounters comes out in 77. Mm-hmm. And he said, I told you, Annie Spielberg was a line producer for me. She worked for us. And they did documentaries on hypnosis and abduction and stuff like this. And Annie Spielberg was working, and she said, Steven would like a copy of the documentary.
Wow.
And so he gave a copy to Steven Spielberg, and 2 years later, you see basically the Holloman Air Force Base story. They're waiting for it on the ground. There's all these people. They know when it's coming. It's being filmed from different vantage points and stuff like that. And according to Bob, he said that later on, Steven Spielberg's mother had come to him and said, you know, Bob, I've seen your version of the landing, and I've seen Steven's version of the landing, and I like Steven's version better. So there was bizarre stories that Bob would never even think, because he was just not interested in the story.
Well,
and
let's go with Bob to his letters for a moment, because what he says on the record is that he got a letter before he was doing the documentary from President Nixon, and it said, "Oh, what do you think of my cabinet? Who would you recommend?" and so on, which I think is interesting anyway. That's kind of like a little bit of outreach. But later, there's a dinner, and this is what Linda Moulton Howe was getting into. Now, what she's talking about is they have this dinner that takes place, and then he comes out and he shows her a letter, and the letter is from Nixon, and it says, "Thank you for your discretion around this project."
On the project we were working on, yes.
Yes. So
and
now
Linda's got a photographic memory, so I trust Linda that she actually saw that. And she mentioned the other researcher. I can't remember if it was Fawcett, or there was another researcher there as well.
Right, exactly.
And that was at Bob's home in Los Angeles before he moved to Arkansas. We had an encounter, Bob, because Linda always comes to Eureka Springs as well. There was an encounter in a restaurant where she confronted him about this. Like, why don't you come clean, Bob? Why don't you? And he said, well, I gave Grant the Nixon letter. But the Nixon letter he was referring to was the one that you mentioned at first. Every president will send out a letter to campaign people, high money people, and ask for suggestions of who do you think should work in the administration. Because you know, once the administration moves out, the new administration comes in, you got to replace every single job. So they're looking for candidates. And that was what that first letter was about. It was just a general letter that had gone out to everybody. And she said, no, you know what I'm talking about, Bob. You showed me that letter. And he sat there, and his wife was with him. And it was the most uncomfortable moment of my life, where he just sat there and he didn't say anything, and he didn't deny it. He didn't do anything. So I think there was probably a letter, and it would be the whole thing that he was under a non-disclosure agreement with Nixon, that he was never allowed to release this letter, and he had mistakenly shown it to Linda Howe.
Now, this is what's interesting about all that, which is that Nixon becomes this pivotal figure behind getting the documentary out. And that little voice that gives Emenegger all this access whenever he comes into conflict with Defense Department officials, and they're like, get out of here. And then 10 minutes later, they're like, hey, you know, showing him around. This is because whoever is overseeing this project, they have presidential approval, and he's able to move around, which that to me explains why he gets this letter from Nixon saying, yeah, for your discretion. Does that make sense to you?
He was very clear about that. He said there was literally nobody we couldn't talk to. We could go wherever we wanted. We had authorization to go everywhere. And that's where he said, there's no cover up. What do you mean there's no cover up? I could go anywhere I wanted. And that's when he would refer to the fact that he would go into the Pentagon without signing in, that they had this unbelievable power. And the problem was, at that point, they didn't really know what questions to ask. Like they were given this story about the Holloman landing. They were given the story about the channeling of the alien and stuff like that. But Roswell wasn't a story then. None of that stuff was out, where, you know, take me to Area 51 and show me the bodies or stuff like that. They didn't know what questions to ask. It was still a very simple blue book, sightings, this kind of stuff. They really didn't have the material that they really needed.
That's fascinating. And now to follow up on Emenegger's documentary, which came out twice and we know was almost aborted in there, at least they pulled the original film that they were going to have in it. And it's kind of fascinating that they were contemplating allowing the Holloman Air Force Base incident to be in that first documentary. Just the fact, I mean, they were really ready and stepping up for some kind of disclosure then. But when we get into that later period, and it's this unusual TV event about UFOs, and it's 1989, can you tell me a little bit about that special?
Well, first, let me tell the story how Bob gets called back again, because in the 75 one, and the story that you may not have heard, at the very end of it, they came to Bob and they said, it was funded by MacArthur Foundation. And they came and said to Bob at the very end, they said, Mr. MacArthur has put up the money, and some of his friends aren't very happy with his name being associated with this thing. So could you keep his name off the credits, but you can keep the money. And it was $250,000. And that was 1975. It was put up for that documentary. So they got to keep the money. And then in the 80s, Maybe even a more significant overture is made. I think it's 1983. Bob is contacted again by Paul Chartle at DAVA, and they said, "Can you come to DAVA? We want to talk to you again." So they go, him and Alan Sandler, and they say, "The government liked the documentary you did in the 1970s, and they'd like you to do it again." And it was at that point that Bob said, "So who's behind this? Is this Reagan?" Because he immediately made the connection, like, who's behind this? And he said he never got an answer. And the guy who was running that one was General Glenn E. Miller. And Glenn E. Miller was the first agent for Ronald Reagan in Hollywood. So he knew, and the other guy, his name was Bob Scott. He was, I think he had a PhD. They were the guys that were running DAVA. And they wanted, on this documentary, they wanted Jacques Vallée and they wanted J. Allen Hynek to be involved in the documentary. And Jacques Vallée actually writes about it in one of his books. He calls it The Dangling Carrot. And he's actually the one that calls it off because he knew what happened in the 70s. Mm-hmm. They're going to get involved. They're going to do all this sort of stuff. Their reputation's on the line. And at the last minute, they're going to pull the key parts. Right. But during that thing that Bob said was very unusual, where they're there, and I think Hynek is there, and Glenn E. Miller says to Paul Chartle, he said, "Okay, we got those UFO films. We want to get them out. I want you to take the UFO films. I want you to take them out and show them to Hynek." And Paul Chartle says, "I'm sorry, General. You have to have whatever it was, a requisition, a request or something. You have to have something. I can't do that. You need a request or a requisition or whatever." He says, "God damn, I'll have your ass. You get the films and you give them to Hynek." And he wouldn't do it. That he wouldn't pull these films out, this requisition. But they were going to pull
on the inside on that one.
What's that?
They have conflict on the inside on that one.
Yeah, there was just this technicality that Chartle was going by the book. That if you do it by the book, I'll give these things. But that's what he was saying. We need to get these films out, and we're going to show them to Hynek. We need these films out. Now, what Bob told me was shortly after that, both Scott and Miller were fired by Weinbrenner. They were removed from, and he said he didn't know whether it had anything to do with that. But he was telling about a bizarre story where they're at their place and Hynek is there, and Miller comes in, this general who's running DAVA, and he said, "I know how it works. They're voice activated. I was inside the craft." And apparently he said they saw Hynek's face, and Hynek was sort of looking like, "I've been in this all this time and they didn't tell me." It was like that's the way both Bob and his wife described it. Like Hynek was totally out of the loop. He suddenly realized he had been had. He didn't know what was going on. And this Miller was talking about the fact that he'd been in the craft and that he was basically like an experiencer. So you have these incidents. And later on, it was actually, I got to know Bob fairly well, did a lot of interviews with him. He actually, this would be going back maybe 5 or 6 years ago, he actually made another overture. They actually went to the Pentagon again, and they tried to set up another documentary. Hal Puthoff had given them some material on these kids in China, these kids that can actually move objects, where they can make objects appear, like telekinesis type stuff. Mm-hmm. And that Hal Puthoff had given a lot of material, or told Emenegger a lot about these kids. And so Alan Sandler wanted to go to China and do a documentary on these kids, this remote viewing, telekinesis, how far the Chinese were advanced on their program, how much they had. And they actually made a pitch, and the Pentagon actually turned them down. But it was only a couple of years ago, they actually made another pitch to do another documentary. So they knew what the process was. But there was a number of efforts, and it was always the same thing, where they put stuff out and they pull it back at the very end.
Wow. Now lead us. So that's really interesting, actually, about the 80s one, because it's something that almost happened there. And of course, when we get into that later 90s period, that's when this unusual live television broadcast happens. And it's kind of like a big mash of all these different people that have been involved in these things. And it harkens back to the documentary a little bit too, but just get us into that. Tell us what it was all about.
Well, as I describe, the way I describe the disclosure thing, I say it's always small d disclosure. It's always gradual disclosure, and it's the same players. It's what was called the Avery under Bill Moore. It's the same players that sort of enter the field, come out. Kit Green has been since the 1960s. He and Hal Puthoff. have had top secret SCI clearances since the late 60s. They were working on the remote viewing program together. They've done all sorts of black ops stuff. They've interacted with the UFO phenomena at little bits and pieces in their career. So these guys keep reappearing. And so the 75 documentary by Bob Emenegger was one of these programs. But as I said, they did it with Disney. And in 1988, they run what I say is the second UFO disclosure program. That was in the last days of the Reagan administration. Reagan was very interested in UFOs, and it was almost like Reagan had set up something to leave the public as he left. And when I remember talking to Billy Cox at the time, because I was dealing with Billy Cox at the time he was writing for Florida Today. And I remember the rumors just before this documentary in October of 1988, about 2 weeks before the election took place, we had actually heard the story about the live alien, that they had a live alien, that Reagan was going to appear on camera with a live alien. This is one of the stories that was running around inside the UFO committee. But what actually happened was this documentary came out, and what it was basically a replay of 1975. You have all the basic same players, you have these Avery type things, and they introduce a bunch of material. So there's no confirming material, but the idea of Area 51 is brought up. That's the first time the word Area 51 is actually brought up. It's on a flow chart that's in that documentary. Wow. And on the flow chart, it shows from the president on down how it all works. You have Project Aquarius, you have DIA, Navy Intelligence, all this kind of stuff going down. And on the one corner, you have Area 51. And on the other side, you have another thing that was not known. The Area 51 story would not come out until the spring of 1989, till 6 months after that documentary. And nobody picked it up in the documentary that there was this Area 51. Nobody knew what it was on this flow chart. On the other side of the flow chart, they had this thing called the DIA Parapsychology Unit, which was the remote viewing program before it was taken over by the CIA and declassified in 1995. It's on a flow chart in 1988 on this documentary. So they introduced Area 51. They introduced the DIA flow chart. This is when they bring up the idea of the live alien, that we have this live alien like strawberry ice cream. So you throw in the strawberry ice cream thing to throw everybody off. Everybody says, it's garbage. I mean,
wait, tell us what that is.
Yeah, well, this is the idea that he liked Tibetan music and that he liked strawberry ice cream. So what you do is you throw the thing out. This is the thing. You throw the idea out, a live alien, then you pull it back by saying it likes strawberry ice cream, and nobody believes the story, but they really remember the fact that there's a live alien. And there was a live alien. If you follow George Knapp, because you remember this is 1988, this is when Bob Lazar comes out, Area 51, in spring of 1989. The only reason Bob Lazar actually comes out is because they have no guest. They're missing a guest. George Knapp knows that there's this guy that claimed to have worked up on Area 51. He's talking to John Lear. They're in debt to John Lear because John Lear broke the stealth fighter story for KLS TV.
So it's a real hit or miss situation, basically.
Yeah, it's just by accident. They put the backlight this guy, and this story goes viral about Area 51. So what happens at that point, and this is significant, it's George Knapp, like 24 Emmy Awards or whatever he's got, investigative journalist. This is not John Lear telling the story. It's not me. This is some high-level guy.
Right.
And so when Bob Lazar came out, he had 24 other witnesses that were telling bits and pieces, and he needed a confirming witness. So what he does, he actually goes and he encounters a guy, and he's told this story a couple times. He told on Paracast. He told it at the Atomic Museum in Las Vegas in a speech there. He tells his story. I needed a confirming witness. So I knew there was one guy that this guy was a very powerful guy. He's one of the top 3 guys at EG&G. He had set the atomic bomb. He had wired the atomic bombs in the 1940s there. If anybody knew that the Area 51 story was true, this guy would know. And so George Knapp tells the story. He goes to meet this guy. He says, how you doing? I'm George Knapp. He goes to all this guy's lectures. He gets to know the guy, and he works on this guy for 6 months. And then the guy invites him to his house, and he goes to his house, and he is showing him these bomb craters and at the test site where they blew all these atomic bombs up. And he's going through the thing, and Bob's looking at these pictures, and then he goes, you didn't come here to look at bomb craters, did you? And George says, no, not really. And he said, I know what you want to talk about. And Bob, and he says, you want to talk about UFOs? And Bob says, yeah. No, George Knapp says, I'd rather talk about that. And the guy's wife says to him, oh, don't start telling them those stories. Don't touch that. And he starts telling George Knapp the fact that Area 51's for real. They got the crafts. And then George says to him, well, weren't you afraid the story was going to get out? And he says, no, we weren't afraid the story was going to get out. We were afraid it was going to get out. And that's when George, because Bob Lazar had told the story of seeing the live alien going down the hall, and he looked in this one window and the live alien was there. And the guy told him to keep his eyes straight ahead. And so he knew the story about the live alien. So he said, what, you mean there was a live alien? And that's when the guy says, and this ties into your story of this guy that has the time capsule. This guy that's telling George Knapp the story says, well, we couldn't communicate with it. And he said, it came across time and space, across the galaxy, and you kept the thing captive. And he said, but we didn't know how to communicate with the thing. And we were afraid it was going to get out. And then later on, you see the movie called Paul. And Paul is the story. It's the fictionalized story of the alien that escapes from Area 51. And this is the same thing. They fictionalize the story. They put it out.
Right.
So George is a highly credible person. And he basically got this confirmation. So you have this story, and all of them. Linda Howe was offered an interview with the live alien. And I asked Bob Emenegger. I said, Bob, you were offered the interview with the live alien. And he said, well, yeah, but that's garbage. That was all garbage. And I said, well, who told you the story? Who made you the offer to interview the live alien? And he said, Paul Chartle. And I said, well, was Paul Chartle reliable? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, then maybe there was something. But a lot of people were offered this interview in the 1980s with this live alien. So the idea was that they actually had this live alien, but it was the same thing. It was this, what Valet talked, the dangling carrot. They put the carrot out. You go to grab the carrot. You tell your part of the story, they get to use you, and they pull the carrot back, the confirming evidence. So they're telling the story, but they're not giving you anything to confirm the story with.
Amazing. It's absolutely, it is incredible. And of course, they came out later and they had this guy who had a film of an alien being interrogated and things like that. And that's almost like a caricature of this real thing that was happening. And I do think the Paul story is significant because, we do have this guy was involved in the crash retrievals, and we were actually talking about him last night, and he had that whole thing about how he helped the alien escape. And that's one of those crash retrieval stories. But there is interesting, there's so many legends about this being and that they had him at a certain point.
Yeah, there's even an interesting story. I don't know if you ever talked to Linda, get her to tell you the story on camera. It's an interesting story. It was almost like spy versus spy. I mean, it's just bizarre story where she gets this phone call and she has to run to this telephone booth. They say you got like 5 minutes to get to this telephone booth. She runs to this telephone booth, picks it up, and she's talking to this guy. And this is where they set her up with the keeper of the live alien. I think he's a captain or something. At the time he's dying. He's in Texas and he's dying. And they offer Linda the interview, that he can go and interview this guy who's dying, who actually was the keeper of the live alien. And so she goes through these phone calls back and forth on phone booths, all this bizarre stuff like that. And then the night she buys the ticket to fly to Texas, and the night before she's to fly, they pick up the phone and they say the interview's off and hang up the phone.
Huh.
So it's the same thing. It's you drag them along and then you pull it, the dangling carrot, you pull it back at the very end. So Linda was involved in a lot of these, and I can't remember on my webpage, I think I list how many people, but I think there was maybe 4 or 5 people. Whitley Strieber, I think, was offered an interview with the live alien as well. There was like 4 or 5 people in the 1980s that were all made this offer of talking to the live alien.
It's fascinating. Where did the disclosure movement go next after '89? The live alien, Reagan leaves office. The Star Wars aspect and SDI is all gone. We go into the Clinton and the Bush and Clinton era. And then what are the strains of disclosure that we're seeing there? Because we know that people come forward like John Mack. We know Lawrence Rockefeller's involved. What is the big 90s push?
Well, the big 90s push is the big move with the MJ-12 documents, because people know about the MJ-12 document that Bill Moore and Bill Moore, Friedman, and Jamie Sandray had, that they got in 1984. Most people don't realize there's 3,700 pages of MJ-12 documents, and most of those were leaked to a guy by the name of Tim Cooper. And this gets into this thing. They're getting entire books with MJ12 stamps on them with handwritten notations. This is where the Byrne memo comes from, the Oppenheimer Eisenhower memo, all these things where Bob and Ryan Wood are contacted. First, Stanton is contacted, this Tim Cooper. And the interesting thing was, you see these connections once you've been through it, and you see all these names keep reappearing. It's all the same names all the time that flow through this thing. At the end of this month, Melinda Leslie is going to do a speech. Her and I are going to do a speech where we're going to, in San Francisco, we're going to go through this whole list of all these characters. And my list is longer than hers. She's sort of got a different criteria. She's got about 50 people, but it's all these Avery people that run through. And she's been doing the same research as me since the 1980s, that these people are part of this disclosure. They move in here. They're with NIDS. They're with Emenegger. They're with the Firmage, when Firmage gets going, they're now part of the Tom DeLonge thing. It's these same characters that keep moving through this sort of thing. So we're going to do this speech where we sort of name all these people, but in the Tim Cooper thing, and he's the guy who was getting the material. He was getting them from the CIA. He would send in FOIA material, and he would get back envelopes with the CIA stamped on the thing with all these documents. And he was getting leaked 3,700 pages of documents from about 5 different sources. One of the things that I found, Ryan Wood and Bob Wood were working on this. And one of the things you see these significant connections, they were showing me the documents. And one was a citation that his father had gotten from Curtis LeMay, but they had spelt LeMay wrong on the document. But he was showing me this thing, and I looked at it, and I saw that he had worked at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, Tim Cooper's father. And I said, can you believe this? He worked for Arthur Lundahl. Arthur Lundahl was the guy who ran the Weird Desk. And so here's a document that nobody realized. Only I, because I knew the story about Bob Emenegger being told about the National Photographic Interpretation Center.
Now that lets us know that the Cooper documents are actually
that his father was a photographic analyst at that lab. Yeah. So you see the connections, and it was almost like his father worked in UFOs, and the son got brought into UFOs. Almost like, you know, the idea that Richard Doty's uncle was a big guy in Blue Book. His father was a UFO guy, and that it runs through families, that the kids sort of run through this sort of thing. So that's what started. So you have 3,700 pages. And that's where people say, oh, Richard Doty is behind MJ12. And I said, you know, I knew Richard Doty in the 1980s, and there's no way Richard Doty is behind this. He was only in the Air Force. He left the Air Force in 85, came back in 87, but he was gone long before these came out.
Inflated importance around Doty. There's no question.
Yeah, this is an operation. This is a major operation. When you're releasing 3,700 pages into the UFO community, this is major, because Jacques Vallée pointed it out. Like, people say, oh, this is disinformation. But when you listen to what Jacques Vallée says, he said, you know, it's very strange. Why would the government spend so much money and so much time to try to disinform a group of people who have literally no influence on anybody? Nobody listens to us. I mean, we're in our own little world, but why would they do this to influence us, to throw us off? There's no point to throwing us off. If they really want to throw us off, they would just shut up.
Let's spotlight the Cooper memo for a minute, because I'm glad you brought that up. The Burnt memo is the key one in all of those documents. I mean, there's so many interesting things in there, but the Burnt memo basically is an authorization to assassinate President Kennedy over the UFO file. And just tell me, go into the Burnt memo a little bit for me.
Well, I never followed the documents, because I always saw them as hoaxes. They were altered documents. Like the Burn memo is a prime example. The story was that they were going to burn the document, and they pulled it out of the fire. And that's just like, that's spycraft. That's like making the story seem. And so what they want is these ideas. They put these ideas. Now, I'm not sure whether the ideas are right. The Kennedy thing, the fact that Oppenheimer worked on it, all this kind of stuff. So what they're doing is they're using these hoax documents that have been altered, putting them out, so that they can actually say they're hoax documents. It doesn't come back. You can't really verify this sort of stuff. But most of the ideas that we have in the UFO community are leaked to us. Nobody discovered anything. The Area 51, the idea about Kennedy, the idea about the live alien, all this sort of stuff about the Falcon, the Condor, all this kind of stuff has been leaked to us. And so they're doing like a fictionalized version of stuff, and we're just repeating the story. And that's what they want, is they want the story out slowly. They want the idea, but they don't want anybody to confirm anything. Because if they wanted to confirm it, they put the president or the CIA director out and actually tell us what's going on.
What
So I
happens?
really followed the documents. I really didn't.
No question. It's incredible disinformation and psyops around it. What happens when they encounter a situation, though, when the information gets out ahead of them? Because
That's a prime example. Bob Emenegger told me that the Holloman Air Force Base story happened in May of 1971. And it happened at 6 o'clock in the morning. And these guys and the radar guys, and he had so many details, unbelievable details. So then 1983, Lundahl is brought to Kirkland Air Force Base, and she has her encounter with Richard Doty, and he starts telling her, oh no, it didn't happen in May of 1971. It happened in 1964. But now there's two stories. Now it's me and Linda are fighting about, no, it's 64, no, it's 71. And that's what they do is if there's a real legitimate story, the fastest way to kill that story is to put something else in there, put a second agent who comes and tells a contrary story with conflicting details, and the UFO community for sure is going to start fighting. And nobody's going to know what's for real. People will know there was a Holloman film, but because neither Linda or I can confirm what the date was, everybody goes, well, it's all disinformation. The idea gets out and nothing happens. Almost like the Area 51 thing. The Area 51 story was to be leaked to John Lear. And John Lear was the guy who was running around talking about the Dulce underground base and the fact that, there's a shootout and they take your soul to the moon after you die and all this kind of stuff. He had these really bizarre ideas, but he told the truth. And so what you see with him is they wanted him to tell the story. And from late 1988 till that interview in 1989 that George Knapp did, it was John Lear telling the story. And nobody believed it. As soon as George Knapp told the story, suddenly everybody started to believe it. It went viral. And in the Dulce base, you remember the story about the Dulce base, the aliens said nobody's allowed to have arms. Somebody has an arms. This shootout starts with the special forces. There's all these people killed. So that story supposedly happened at the Dulce base. But Bob Lazar, one of the stories that he tells is the second day he's on the base, he's shown 127 documents. And this makes no sense. Like when you're training somebody, you don't tell them how the whole program works. You show them where the washroom is, you show them where the lunchroom is. That's about all you tell them. And he's suddenly given all these documents. And one of the documents he's shown is the shootout underground, except his shootout happens under Area 51. It's exactly the same story, except that happens under Area 51. So that's how they distort the stories. They put the same story with two different things, and we're bumping around with each other. And we understand there was a shootout. We understand there was a live alien, but nobody can confirm anything because we're all fighting about the details of the story.
They according to that pattern, they knew Lazar was going to come out and be the point man on the story, even though he was coming out as a genuine, legitimate whistleblower about what he was seeing. Yeah,
they showed him because, and what I say, if you want to understand the Bob Lazar story, you got to understand how it started. How it started was he met Teller at Los Alamos, and then he comes and he has an encounter with John Lear. They're doing an assessment on the house and they start talking UFOs or whatever. And he says, I want to get back in the field. And he says, well, phone Teller. He runs the operation. Phone him and tell him you want to go up to the base. So in November of 1988, Bob Lazar phones Edward Teller and he says, I'd like to get back in the field. And Teller says, where would you like to work? Would you like to work up at Livermore where I am? Or would you like to go up to the base? And he said, I'd like to go up to the base. Within weeks, he's on the base. He needs his top secret security clearance. Within 2 weeks, he's on the base. But first, he does 3 interviews with EG&G. And George Knapp will confirm this. The second interview, the first question in the second interview was, do you know John Lear? And what do you think about him? So they knew before he went onto the base that he was friends with John Lear. That's what they wanted. They wanted John Lear to carry the story because nobody's going to believe John Lear. They didn't realize that it would go viral. When it goes viral, they actually, for example, Bob Lazar, they told him when the test was. It was Wednesday night at 8 o'clock or whatever, and they go up there 3 times. This one time John Lear isn't there, but the third time they get caught. So why would they tell Bob Lazar when the test is? Because they wanted him to take John Lear up there. They wanted the story out that they were testing this thing. And so when they capture him the third night, he gets called into Indian Springs the next morning. Bob Lazar is taken in and he claims they put a gun to his head and they say, when we told you it was top secret, that didn't mean to bring your friends out to watch the test. And what happens is so he's leaked top secret material, the most highly classified subject in the United States. And what do? They don't even fire him. They don't arrest him. They don't fire him. All they do is suspend his security clearance and said, your wife is having an affair with her instructor, with her airplane instructor. And we overheard this on the phone calls, and we're going to cut you a break. And they actually invite him back to Area 51. It's Bob Lazar who didn't go back to Area 51. He was never fired. He was never arrested. Why not? Because they had more stuff they wanted him to put out. So they were going to invite him back to the base, show him some more stuff. It was Bob Lazar that quit. He didn't get fired.
It's that same group. It's the small D disclosure group in there that is trying to create these conditions to put it out their way about the UFO file. Now,